The roar of the airplane's engines vibrated through the cabin as the flight to Los Angeles cruised at 35,000 feet. Inside the first-class cabin, a tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of murmured conversations and the occasional clink of a glass. The flight was smooth, the skies clear, but something felt off. Passengers in first class, sipping their champagne or reading their magazines, had no idea that in a matter of minutes, their flight would take a dramatic turn. Captain Blake Matthews, a seasoned pilot in his mid-40s, sat behind the cockpit doors, hands on the controls, his mind racing. It was his third flight this week, and his thoughts were preoccupied with everything that had gone wrong in his life. The divorce papers still hadn't been finalized, and each day seemed to drag on with the weight of emotional baggage he couldn't shake. Blake had always been a man of control, of precision, but lately, his life felt anything but. He let out a long sigh as he glanced over at his co-pilot, who was busy adjusting the autopilot systems. "Everything good?" Blake asked, though his voice had a tinge of weariness. "Yeah, everything steady." "You okay?" the co-pilot asked, sensing the tension in Blake's demeanor. Blake gave him a quick nod, forcing a smile. "Just tired." "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Every day felt like a battle, and the loneliness crept up on him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Blake had been a fighter pilot before, always trained for the worst. But this? The emotional wreckage of his personal life felt like a battle he wasn't equipped to fight. And right now, he didn't know where to find the strength to keep going. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the one Blake was experiencing in the cockpit. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, one of Hollywood's biggest stars, sat quietly by the window, looking out at the endless blue sky. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, and his brow furrowed slightly in thought. He had just finished filming his latest project and was taking some much-needed time off to recharge. The press had hounded him for weeks, and the expectations of millions of fans weighed heavily on his shoulders. Despite the glamorous lifestyle, Dwayne was no stranger to loneliness. Fame had its price, and the pressure to constantly be The Rock, larger than life, invincible, was exhausting. It had taken a toll on his relationships, his happiness, and his sense of self. Now, he was on this flight to escape, to disconnect, if only for a little while. His personal life had been in turmoil lately too, though no one would know it from the persona he projected on screen. The public didn't see the long hours he spent trying to reconcile with the man he had become, the man who couldn't seem to let go of the past. Dwayne had made a lot of mistakes, just like anyone, but unlike most, his mistakes had played out on the global stage. As the flight progressed, Dwayne's mind wandered. His phone had been turned off for the duration of the flight, a rare move, but it was necessary. He needed to be alone with his thoughts. He knew that once the plane landed, he would be thrust back into the chaos of his life. But for now, he could pretend to be just another man on an airplane, trying to find some peace. It was just as Dwayne was about to lean back in his seat and close his eyes when Captain Blake Matthews appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. His posture was stiff, his eyes scanning the cabin for any issues. The crew had just completed their rounds, and Blake was making his usual check of the flight. Dwayne, who had been keeping to himself, barely noticed the pilot's entrance at first. But when their eyes met, something shifted in the air. There was an unspoken recognition between the two men, though neither knew it. Blake couldn't place it, but something about Dwayne's presence stirred a long-buried feeling of anger deep within him. As the flight went on, the tension between the two men grew, unnoticed by everyone else. To an outsider, it seemed like a simple coincidence, a pilot and a famous actor sharing the same flight. But for Blake, this encounter felt like fate, or perhaps something far worse. It was as though the universe had thrown these two men together for a reason Blake wasn't sure he was ready to face. The real tipping point came when the flight attendants came around with drinks. Dwayne ordered a gin and tonic, a small comfort in the midst of the chaos of his mind. As the flight attendant approached Blake's seat, he nodded politely, his mind still clouded by the weight of his thoughts. When the attendant turned to offer him a drink, Blake hesitated for a moment, then took the glass she offered. The Rock, meanwhile, was busy scanning through a magazine, momentarily distracted. That's when Blake, perhaps without fully realizing it, made a comment that would set everything in motion. "You know," Blake said, his voice a little more bitter than he intended, "it must be nice to be able to escape from everything. You know, pretend to be someone else for a living." Dwayne's head snapped up, caught off guard by the sudden remark. He hadn't been expecting the bitterness in Blake's voice. He gave a tight smile, trying to brush it off. "I'm just trying to enjoy my flight, man. Didn't mean to offend you." But Blake wasn't finished. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, even years, flared up in an instant. "Yeah, must be nice to be able to fly around the world, taking whatever you want, living the dream. I've lost everything, and you're sitting there like you've got it all figured out." The words came out more harshly than Blake intended, but once they were spoken, they hung in the air, thick and charged. Dwayne's eyes narrowed, a flash of recognition crossing his face. He knew exactly what Blake was feeling. The anger. The frustration. The sense of being trapped in a life that seemed beyond repair. But instead of responding with the same level of aggression, Dwayne leaned back in his seat, his tone calm yet firm. "You don't know me, man. And you don't know what it's like to be in my shoes either," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying weight. The words hit Blake like a slap in the face. For a moment, he was speechless, caught in the tension of the moment. The silence stretched on as both men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. The passengers around them had started to notice the growing tension, their eyes darting between the two men. Some were unsure whether this was some sort of joke or if things were about to escalate. And just as quickly as it began, it happened. A moment of rage, a flurry of movement, and then Blake lunged toward Dwayne with surprising force. The scene in the first-class cabin froze. The flight attendants rushed forward, but Blake and the Rock were locked in an intense standoff. The passengers were too stunned to react, their eyes wide with disbelief. What had started as a chance encounter had now spiraled into something no one could have predicted. But what no one saw coming was the moment that followed, the moment of forgiveness. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The airplane was rocking ever so slightly as it cruised through the sky. Passengers who had initially been startled by the commotion in the first-class cabin began to relax once again, but the tension still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Blake Matthews, the man who had just exploded in a fit of rage, was sitting in the small crew area at the back of the plane, his head buried in his hands, trying to process what had just happened. Captain Blake Matthews wasn't just any pilot. He had flown fighter jets during his time in the military and had logged thousands of hours in the cockpit. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control, both in the air and in his life. But today, he had lost control, and in front of a celebrity no less. The shame of it was overwhelming. His life had been spiraling downward for months now. The divorce papers had come in the mail only a few days ago, finalizing the end of his marriage to Emily, his high school sweetheart. Emily had tried to be patient with him, but Blake's constant emotional withdrawal and increasingly erratic behavior had pushed her to the brink. She had tried to give him the space he needed, but after years of silence and isolation, there was nothing left for her to hold on to. She'd given him an ultimatum: seek help or she'd walk away. He hadn't listened, and now she was gone. Blake's eyes stung as he ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts drowning in regret and self-loathing. He had been an excellent pilot, disciplined and precise, but in his personal life, he was a wreck. Flying had always been his escape, his therapy, but now, even that wasn't enough. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Emily, his failures, the hollow feeling that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in his chest. As he sat in the cramped seat in the crew area, Blake replayed the moments of the confrontation with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson over and over in his head. What had he been thinking? What had caused him to lash out like that? It wasn't like him, not like the man he used to be, at least. He had always been cool under pressure, a man who could handle anything life threw his way. But something about Dwayne's presence had triggered something in him. Maybe it was the way Dwayne seemed so put together, the way his every move exuded confidence. Or maybe it was because Blake saw himself in the other man, someone who was constantly trying to fill a void but never quite succeeding. Blake felt a pang of guilt. He had never met Dwayne before, but he knew who he was, everyone did. The man had it all, fame, fortune, success. And here he was, a pilot struggling with his own demons, taking out his frustrations on a man who, as far as Blake could tell, had done nothing to deserve it. The sound of the cockpit door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. The co-pilot, a young man named Jeremy, stepped inside with a concerned look on his face. "Blake, you all right?" Blake gave him a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Just need a minute." Jeremy took a seat next to him, sensing that something was off but not pressing the issue. "You sure? That was a pretty intense situation back there. I mean, the passengers are still talking about it." Blake let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm an idiot." "It's not like you to lose your cool," Jeremy said quietly. "What happened?" Blake's gaze drifted to the small window, watching the endless stretch of clouds below them. The silence between them stretched for a moment as Blake tried to find the words. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know, Jeremy. I don't know what happened. I've been carrying this weight for so long, and it just boiled over. I shouldn't have done it. It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm drowning, you know." Jeremy nodded. He had always respected Blake, but this side of him, the vulnerable, raw side, was new. "I get it. I know you've been going through a lot. But Blake, that's not the way to deal with it. You're better than that." Blake leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling of the crew cabin. "I don't know if I am anymore," he murmured, barely audible. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was sitting back in his seat, trying to shake off the confrontation. His muscles were still tense, his jaw set tight. He hadn't been expecting the pilot to lash out at him like that. But now that the shock had worn off, he couldn't help but wonder what had driven Blake to such extremes. Dwayne had seen a lot in his years in the public eye. He had been the center of countless media storms, but nothing quite like this. This wasn't some trivial scandal or petty online feud. This was raw, human emotion on display, the kind of emotion Dwayne knew all too well. The kind that came with being constantly in the spotlight, always under pressure to be perfect, to be untouchable. Dwayne wasn't perfect, though. He had his own struggles. He had built his empire on charisma and strength, but that didn't mean he didn't face battles of his own. What most people didn't see were the sleepless nights, the insecurities, the struggles with his sense of identity. He had been taught to push those feelings aside, to bury them deep, and just keep moving forward. But there were days when it felt impossible to keep up the facade. And now, here was Blake Matthews, a man who had cracked under the weight of his own emotions. A man who, Dwayne could sense, was carrying the same burden he had carried for years. The silence in the cabin stretched on, and Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Blake's outburst than just a random burst of anger. Something had driven the man to snap, and Dwayne, in his own way, understood that pain. As the flight continued, Dwayne couldn't help but think about Blake's outburst. The pilot wasn't just angry with him, Dwayne could sense the deeper issues, the unresolved pain. He had seen that same kind of pain in his own life. Dwayne wasn't sure what had happened between Blake and his wife, but he could tell that it was something that had left its mark on him. Back in the crew area, Blake stood up, brushing himself off as he walked toward the cockpit. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he needed to get back to the job at hand. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences of his actions, but one thing was certain: he couldn't continue running from his pain. As he walked back to the cockpit, Blake paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel in control. He wasn't sure where his life was headed, but one thing was clear: he was going to have to confront the very thing he had been avoiding for so long. The door to the cockpit opened, and Blake stepped inside, ready to face the rest of the flight, and whatever awaited him when they landed. The journey was just beginning. Blake Matthews had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. As a seasoned pilot, he had faced storms, mechanical failures, and even life-threatening situations with a sense of composure that others admired. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the chaos of his personal life. And nothing had been as raw and unpredictable as the emotional eruption that had just occurred on this flight. The moment he entered the cockpit, he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. The co-pilot, Jeremy, was focused on the instruments, adjusting the controls as the flight continued on its path toward Los Angeles. But Blake wasn't really paying attention to the flight details. He was lost in his thoughts, guilt, anger, shame, all swirling in his mind like a storm he couldn't escape. Blake had barely been in the cockpit for a minute when his mind drifted back to the incident in first class. He could still see Dwayne's face, the confusion, the restraint in his eyes. It was a moment that Blake couldn't shake off, and as much as he tried to push it to the back of his mind, the more it consumed him. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed to get his head back in the game. This flight wasn't going to fly itself, and there were passengers relying on him to get them safely to their destination. But as much as he wanted to focus on the job, Blake's thoughts were still tangled in the past. Memories of Emily, the woman he had loved and lost, came rushing back. Their marriage had been beautiful at first, full of promise, full of laughter. But as the years passed, Blake's obsession with his career and his inability to deal with his own insecurities had created a rift between them. They had become strangers, living under the same roof but emotionally disconnected. Blake's chest tightened at the thought of Emily. He had never truly understood how his actions, or lack thereof, had hurt her. And now, sitting in the cockpit of an airplane, far away from everything, it was too late to go back. The damage had been done, and he couldn't take back the words, the silence, the absence. "Captain, are you all right?" Jeremy's voice brought Blake back to the present. Blake blinked, his hand still resting on the control yoke. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to refocus. "Yeah, just thinking. You know, it's one of those days." Jeremy didn't push him further, sensing that Blake wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he nodded and adjusted a few more dials on the control panel. The plane was flying smoothly, but the silence between the two men felt heavy, like a wall had been built between them. Jeremy, like many others, had seen the cracks in Blake's composure, and although he respected his captain, he couldn't help but wonder what was going on beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in first class, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was staring out the window, his thoughts racing just as much as Blake's. The confrontation had left a lingering tension in the air, and while Dwayne was no stranger to conflict, something about Blake's outburst had hit him deeper than he cared to admit. He had dealt with his own demons over the years, the pressure to be perfect, the constant demands of fame, and the struggles to find peace in his own life. He wasn't some untouchable figure, immune to hurt. He knew what it was like to feel like he was drowning in expectations, like every moment of his life was under a microscope. But Blake? There was something raw about the man, something that made Dwayne feel like he had seen a reflection of himself in the pilot. It was a strange feeling, this connection to a man who seemed so different from him, yet in some ways, so similar. Dwayne shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the unease. He had come on this flight to find some peace, to escape for a little while. But now, the flight had become a reminder of everything he had been trying to avoid. He had been working non-stop for months, and this brief escape had become more complicated than he had anticipated. The flight attendants had resumed their service, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers, but Dwayne hardly noticed. He wasn't hungry, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for more small talk. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, trying to push the whirlwind of thoughts out of his mind. What had driven Blake to snap? What was it about this pilot that made Dwayne want to understand him more? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain: the tension between them wasn't something that could be ignored. It felt like an unfinished story, one that needed resolution. And in that moment, Dwayne realized something that surprised him: he didn't just want to leave the situation unresolved. He wanted to do something about it. Maybe, just maybe, this flight was about more than just getting from one place to another. Maybe it was a chance for him to confront the things he'd been avoiding, the things that had been weighing on him just as much as they weighed on Blake. The flight continued in a quiet, tense rhythm. Most of the passengers in first class had returned to their entertainment, books, movies, or sleep, but the encounter between the two men hung in the air like a silent storm. No one was saying it aloud, but it was clear to everyone in the cabin that something was not quite right. Blake had stayed in the cockpit for most of the flight, his mind wrestling with his emotions. It wasn't like him to let something affect his work, but today felt different. There was a heaviness in his chest that no amount of flying could lift. He knew he had to find a way to let go of the anger, the shame, and the regret, but how? How did you move on when your past kept clawing at you, refusing to let go? And then, as if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. It was the flight attendant, her voice soft but clear: "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." Blake's hands tightened around the controls as he began the descent. His mind was still swirling, but there was no room for hesitation now. The passengers were relying on him to bring them safely to the ground. He had to do his job. For just a moment, Blake allowed himself to breathe, a small, shallow breath. There was still time to face the mess of his life, but right now, his focus had to be on what was in front of him. The descent was smooth, and he could feel the weight of the flight beginning to lift as they neared the airport. But as he prepared to land the plane, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about getting from one place to another. Something had shifted in him, something he didn't understand yet. The flight was far from over, not just in the air, but in his life. There was more to come. Dwayne opened his eyes and sat up straighter, his mind still restless. He knew he would have to face Blake soon, whether he was ready for it or not. But he also knew that this confrontation, the rawness of it, had created an opportunity. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something bigger. As the plane descended into the skies of Los Angeles, both Blake and Dwayne felt the weight of the moment, a quiet tension brewing. Neither man knew it yet, but their paths were about to cross in a way neither had expected. And in the midst of all their turmoil, they were about to find that sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can lead to the greatest changes. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels kissing the runway as it began its final descent. The sudden change in altitude had a way of jolting Blake Matthews back into reality. For the last few hours, he had been fighting an internal battle, trying to find some kind of peace with himself, but there had been no escape from the turmoil. Not in the sky, not in the cockpit, not even in the quiet of the crew cabin. His hands were steady on the controls as the plane glided through its final descent, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere far below, a life he no longer recognized awaited him. The life of a man who had lost his way. "Welcome to Los Angeles, ladies and gentlemen," the voice of the flight attendant rang over the intercom, her tone pleasant yet professional. "We hope you enjoyed your flight. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop. Thank you for flying with us today." Blake began the final stages of the landing procedures, his mind shifting from emotional turmoil back to professional autopilot. The air was clear, the city sprawling in front of them as they slowly taxied toward the gate. Dwayne Johnson, who had been unusually quiet for most of the flight, finally shifted in his seat as the plane began to slow down. He looked out of the window, catching a glimpse of the Los Angeles skyline. It was a view he knew well, one he'd seen 1,000 times, but today, it felt different. The weight of what had happened between him and Blake seemed to hover in the air, just as tangible as the smog that stretched across the city. Despite his natural charm, the man could be introspective. A fierce optimist, yes, but also someone who spent far too many nights questioning the choices he'd made. In the chaos of his life, he found himself constantly asking if he was truly being the man he wanted to be, or just the man others expected him to be. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, Dwayne took a deep breath, slowly letting it out. His thoughts returned to Blake, his outburst, and what could be happening beneath the surface of the stoic pilot. Dwayne wasn't an expert in psychology, but he had been around long enough to understand that people didn't always act out of nowhere. There was always something deeper, something unresolved. Maybe he had been too quick to judge Blake. Maybe there was more to this situation than met the eye. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and Dwayne stood, stretching his long legs. He had no real plans for the day, just meetings and the usual press events. But the encounter with Blake had unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. And as much as he told himself to let it go and move on, the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. "Hey, Dwayne, are you all right?" one of the flight attendants asked as she passed by. Dwayne gave her a soft smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just need to stretch out." He made his way toward the front of the plane, walking toward the exit. But as he passed the cockpit, he hesitated. Something told him he needed to say something, to address what had happened, if only for his own peace of mind. Blake was still in the cockpit, wrapping up his post-flight duties. Dwayne stepped inside, and the pilot looked up, his expression unreadable. "Blake," Dwayne said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of sincerity. "I just wanted to say something. About what happened earlier. I don't know what's going on with you, but whatever it is, I hope you know you don't have to carry it alone. You've got people who care about you, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Blake blinked, his heart pounding slightly. He hadn't expected Dwayne to say anything, especially not something that felt so genuine. The pilot opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. His chest tightened, emotions rising again, but this time, he didn't push them away. "Thanks, Dwayne," Blake finally managed. It's been a rough time." Dwayne nodded, understanding. "I get it. Life can really knock you down, and sometimes you feel like you've got no way out. But trust me, you do. And I think, deep down, you already know that." Blake didn't respond immediately, just gave a faint nod. He didn't know how to react. The last person he expected to offer him any kind of comfort was Dwayne Johnson. He had imagined the man would be upset, maybe even holding a grudge. But here Dwayne was, speaking with more compassion than Blake had felt in a long time. Dwayne smiled, his signature warmth returning to his face. "Anyway, you're a good guy, Blake. Don't forget that." With that, Dwayne turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Blake alone in the cockpit once again. The words hung in the air like an unanswered question. "Don't forget that." Blake ran a hand through his hair, feeling something shift in him. The heaviness that had followed him since his divorce, the anger that had boiled over into an outburst in front of a stranger, was beginning to ease, just a little. Maybe Dwayne's words had been exactly what he needed to hear. Maybe this brief encounter, this unexpected moment of kindness, could be the start of something new. Outside the airplane, the rush of Los Angeles awaited. People were already moving through the terminals, eager to get to their destinations. Blake's feet felt heavy as he made his way to the crew exit, but there was a small part of him that felt lighter than he had in a long time. He wasn't sure where his life was headed, or what this strange encounter meant. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, he had found a small spark of hope in the unlikeliest of places. And that spark? It was worth holding on to. Dwayne was already on his way to his waiting car when he felt his phone vibrate. He glanced at it briefly and saw a message pop up from his manager. Important meeting in 30 minutes. Get ready. With a sigh, Dwayne slid the phone back into his pocket. He'd deal with the meeting later. For now, he couldn't shake the thought of Blake Matthews. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected places. And maybe, just maybe, he had helped someone today. As Blake walked through the terminal, his footsteps seemed almost weightless. The weight of the past few hours had begun to lift, but the questions about his life lingered in the back of his mind. He had never been one to rely on others for help, but Dwayne's unexpected kindness had stirred something deep within him. It was rare for someone to be so genuine, especially in a world full of facades and surface-level interactions. Blake's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting a standard work message or perhaps a reminder about his schedule, but what he saw made his heart skip a beat. It was a text from Emily, his ex-wife. Can we talk? I know it's been a while, but I need to explain things. Please meet me at our old coffee shop tomorrow. I'll be there at 10. Blake's fingers hovered over the screen, the words stinging more than he had expected. Emily had reached out, after all these years, she had reached out. He had no idea what she wanted to say, but a flood of emotions rushed through him. Guilt. Regret. The hope that perhaps there was a way to repair what had been broken. He had spent years running from the reality of his divorce. The fight, the silence, the way they had both retreated into their own worlds until it was too late to go back. The thought of seeing her again, hearing her voice, seeing her face, made Blake both nervous and strangely hopeful. He tapped the screen, typing a response. I'll be there. See you tomorrow. Meanwhile, Dwayne had made his way to the meeting with his manager. It was a typical, high-pressure business meeting, but as the minutes passed, Dwayne couldn't fully focus. His mind kept returning to the brief encounter with Blake. It was something he couldn't shake off, something he felt deep down in his bones. He had been around enough to know that people didn't just lash out like that for no reason. There was always more beneath the surface. And Blake? Dwayne could see it. The man was carrying something heavy, something that weighed him down in ways words couldn't explain. Dwayne shifted in his seat as his manager launched into yet another discussion about his schedule, but his thoughts drifted away. He wondered how Blake was feeling now, what he was thinking. Was he still holding on to that anger? Or had Dwayne's words, however brief, made a difference? His manager, noticing his distraction, finally cleared his throat. Dwayne. Are you with me? Dwayne blinked, refocusing on the conversation. He hadn't realized how much his mind had wandered. Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Let's talk about the meeting with the producers. It wasn't that Dwayne didn't care about his career, he did. But right now, it felt almost insignificant compared to what had happened on that plane. There was something about Blake's vulnerability that had struck a chord with him. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Blake really was when the mask came off. The manager droned on, but Dwayne's attention was elsewhere, still fixated on Blake and the emotions that seemed to have been bubbling just under the surface. The next morning came far too quickly. Blake found himself pacing outside the familiar coffee shop, his eyes darting to every passerby, every car that pulled into the lot. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so nervous. Not even before a flight. Not even when he had been about to make important decisions in the cockpit. But this? This felt different. He had come to this coffee shop countless times during his marriage to Emily. It had been their place, a small, cozy shop on the corner of a busy street. They would sit at the same table, talk about their days, laugh about silly things, and dream about the future. That future felt so far away now, almost like a lifetime ago. He pushed the door open and walked inside, the familiar smell of coffee beans hitting him. It felt like nothing had changed. The same barista greeted him with a warm smile, and the sound of quiet chatter filled the air. Blake scanned the room, but there was no sign of Emily yet. He decided to wait. There was no turning back now. Dwayne, meanwhile, had a few hours before his next event. The press conference would begin soon, but his mind was still on Blake and what had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the man's outburst, about how he had opened up for just a brief moment, and how Dwayne had offered him a kind word. There was something about it that felt right, but it wasn't enough. Blake needed more than just one moment of kindness. Dwayne made a decision. He wasn't going to let it go. He would reach out to Blake. Somehow, someway, he would offer him more than just words. He grabbed his phone, typed a quick message, and hit send. Blake, I know it's a bit sudden, but I want to meet up. I think we could both use a real conversation. I'm free later today. Let me know if you're open to it. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of determination. Whatever Blake was going through, Dwayne knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let the man face it alone. Back at the coffee shop, Blake's heart skipped when he saw Emily walk through the door. She looked the same, yet different. There was a weariness in her eyes, a quiet sadness that he hadn't seen before. She was dressed simply, but her presence seemed to fill the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily took a tentative step forward, and Blake found himself standing, unsure of what to do next. This was the moment he had been dreading, but now that it was here, he realized he wasn't as prepared as he had thought. Blake, Emily said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you for coming. Blake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Of course, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. This was it. The moment of truth. The chance to face the past and maybe, just maybe, start to heal. As they sat down, Blake realized that today, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He had come here expecting closure, but perhaps this meeting would be the beginning of something even more unexpected: forgiveness. Blake sat across from Emily, their eyes meeting with the kind of tension that comes from years of unspoken words. The hum of the coffee shop, the soft clinking of cups, the occasional murmur of patrons, all felt distant. It was as if the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of them in this small, familiar corner of their past. Emily's hands were wrapped around her coffee mug, her fingers trembling slightly. She had always been the strong one, the anchor in their relationship, and yet now, Blake saw the cracks in her calm facade. It made his chest tighten. He had always imagined that seeing her again would be some kind of grand, emotional moment. But now, it felt like something simpler, something more fragile. Blake took a deep breath, breaking the silence. You said you wanted to talk. About what happened? I don't really know what to expect from this, but I'm here. Emily's lips pressed together as she nodded, taking a moment before speaking. I know it's been a long time, and I don't know how much time we have, or what we can even say to make things better. But I've thought about you every day since we parted. I know I didn't handle things well, and I can't take back the hurt I caused. But I've been trying to make sense of it all. What went wrong, where we went wrong. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to his coffee cup. He hadn't come here expecting to be hit with guilt or a flood of emotions, but hearing her speak like this was enough to make him feel the weight of their past all over again. I don't even know where to start, Emily. We've been through so much, and I don't even know if there's a way to go back to what we had. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. I don't think we can go back. I don't think we're meant to. But maybe, we could find a way to forgive each other, Blake. Maybe we could start there. She paused, glancing down at her hands before looking back up at him. I'm not asking for anything from you. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. I've missed you. And I know I didn't show you how much I loved you, and for that, I'm sorry. Blake felt a lump rise in his throat. Her words hit him harder than he expected. The apology he never thought he'd hear had come, but now, as he sat across from her, all the pain and disappointment of their failed marriage rushed forward like an overwhelming tide. Emily, I don't know how to forgive you for some of the things that happened. I was angry. I didn't understand why you shut me out. I didn't know what to do, and it felt like I was invisible to you. I felt lost. Like I was giving everything, and it wasn't enough. Blake's voice cracked, the years of frustration bubbling up. I loved you so much. And then, one day, it just felt like you stopped loving me. Emily's eyes shimmered, and for a moment, Blake thought he saw a tear slip down her cheek. But she quickly wiped it away, her hands trembling more now. I never stopped loving you, Blake. I didn't know how to handle everything. I thought I could fix it all on my own. I was so afraid of being vulnerable. I thought I was protecting you by pulling away, but I see now that all I did was push you further away. I'm so sorry for that. There was an awkward silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Blake struggled with his own emotions, his heart torn between the remnants of love he still felt and the anger that had festered for so long. They had both hurt each other, in different ways, and the pieces of their relationship had shattered beyond recognition. But as he sat there, listening to Emily's apology, he realized something he hadn't even considered before. It wasn't about going back. It wasn't about fixing everything or pretending like it never happened. It was about finding peace, about letting go of the bitterness that had weighed them both down for so long. I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily. Not yet. But. Blake took a deep breath, his heart racing. But I want to. I want to try. Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, the tension between them softened. She reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his, unsure of whether he would pull away or not. But Blake didn't move. Slowly, he allowed his hand to rest next to hers. I don't expect everything to be fixed in one conversation, Blake. I just needed you to know how deeply I regret the way things turned out. She whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I was being strong, but I see now that I wasn't. I was just afraid. And I let that fear ruin what we had. Blake nodded, his throat tight. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand gesture or an instant fix, but it was something. It was a starting point. And that was all he needed. Maybe we can take it slow, Blake said, his voice barely audible. Maybe we can find some kind of peace with each other. No promises, no grand gestures. Just, taking it one step at a time. Emily smiled through her tears, a smile that felt like the first real smile they'd shared in years. I'd like that. More than you know. As Blake and Emily sat together, talking through the past and cautiously stepping into the uncertain future, Blake found himself thinking back to the events of the past few days, the encounter with Dwayne, the unexpected kindness, and now this fragile conversation with Emily. He had never imagined that he would be sitting here, trying to forgive and heal from the wounds of his marriage, but somehow, in the middle of it all, he felt a small, quiet sense of peace beginning to form. And as the conversation continued, Blake realized something important. The first step toward healing was not just forgiveness, it was finding the strength to face the pain, to confront it, and to take that first step toward understanding. For the first time in a long while, Blake didn't feel alone in his journey. Maybe there were still a lot of things left unsaid, but at least now, there was a glimmer of hope. And that was more than enough for him. Later that afternoon, Dwayne received a response to his message from Blake. Hey, Dwayne. I'm glad you reached out. I don't know what will come of it, but I think it's time I talked about everything. Let's meet up tomorrow. Dwayne smiled at the message, a feeling of relief washing over him. He had no idea what would come of the conversation, but he knew one thing for sure: helping Blake, even in the smallest way, was the right thing to do. As Dwayne typed out his reply, he couldn't help but think that this strange chain of events, these small acts of kindness and forgiveness, might just be leading both of them to something neither of them had expected, a new beginning. The next morning, Blake woke up with a heaviness in his chest. His meeting with Emily had stirred up emotions he hadn't expected. A strange combination of guilt, relief, and hope had settled inside him, but it also felt overwhelming. The journey to forgiveness, his own and hers, wasn't something that could be fixed in a single conversation. He knew that. But at least there had been a crack in the wall, a small opening for healing. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the clear sky. There was something calming about it, but also something unsettling. The clarity of the world outside made him feel like he should have all the answers, but he didn't. He didn't know what would happen after yesterday, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Blake looked at his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. There was a message from Dwayne. "Blake, I'm glad you're willing to meet. I think there's more we both need to say. I'll meet you at the park at noon, if you're free. Take care." Blake couldn't help but wonder how Dwayne was feeling. The kindness he had shown Blake just a couple of days ago felt like an outlier in Blake's life, like a moment of clarity in a storm of confusion. He wasn't used to people like Dwayne, people who stepped in without hesitation, who showed empathy without expecting anything in return. And yet, Blake couldn't help but feel drawn to this man's genuine nature. Maybe that's what he needed in his life right now, someone who wasn't afraid to reach out, to offer a hand when it was most needed. Blake sighed and stood up, grabbing his jacket and wallet. He didn't have much of a plan for the day, but meeting Dwayne felt like a step in the right direction. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he was willing to face whatever came his way. The park was relatively quiet when Blake arrived. The soft chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze created a serene atmosphere, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He spotted Dwayne sitting on a bench near a small pond, looking as calm as ever. Blake approached, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the park. Dwayne looked up and smiled when he saw Blake. "Hey, man. I'm glad you could make it." Blake nodded, taking a seat next to him. "Yeah, of course. I don't really know where to start, but I guess we can start here." Dwayne chuckled lightly, leaning back on the bench. "We don't have to dive into anything heavy right away. We're just two guys trying to figure out our stuff, right? No pressure." Blake appreciated the ease with which Dwayne spoke. It made the conversation feel more approachable, less like an interrogation and more like two people sharing their experiences. Still, Blake couldn't help but feel the weight of his past pressing in on him. He wasn't used to letting people in, wasn't used to discussing the things that made him feel vulnerable. "I've been dealing with a lot of things lately," Blake began, his voice low. "Things with Emily, my past, all the mistakes I made. I've tried to ignore it, push it aside, but it's been catching up to me. And I don't know what to do with it anymore." Dwayne turned to face Blake, his expression serious but compassionate. "That's the first step, right? Acknowledging it. You've been carrying that weight for too long. You can't keep running from it." Blake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know how to stop running. It's what I've always done. Push things down, keep going, pretend everything's fine." He paused, feeling the sting of the truth. "But it's not fine. I'm not fine." Dwayne didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Blake, like he was waiting for him to continue. When Blake finally looked over at him, he saw that Dwayne wasn't judging him. There was no condemnation in his eyes, only understanding. "Look, Blake," Dwayne started, his voice steady, "I get it. I really do. We all have our way of coping, of dealing with things. You might think pushing it all away works, but eventually, it catches up to you. And it sounds like that's what's happening now. You're ready to confront it. You're ready to heal. Blake's eyes flickered with doubt. I don't know. I mean, there's so much to unravel. So many things I've never said out loud, things that I've kept inside for years. I'm not sure I can even handle it. Dwayne nodded, his expression calm. It's not about handling it all at once. It's about starting the process. You've been through a lot, Blake. And it's going to take time. But you don't have to do it alone. That's the point of having people around you. It's not about being strong all the time. It's about being willing to let others in when you need help. Blake swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had never considered it that way before. He had always thought that strength meant bearing it all alone, dealing with things in silence. But maybe Dwayne was right. Maybe true strength wasn't about carrying everything on your own. Maybe it was about allowing others to help, to share the burden. I guess I've never really let anyone help me before, Blake admitted quietly. I've always thought I had to handle it myself. Dwayne placed a hand on Blake's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. And that's okay. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Not if you don't want to. Blake's heart felt lighter, but there was still an ache, deep inside him. There was a long road ahead, one filled with hard truths and difficult decisions. But for the first time in a long while, Blake felt like he wasn't walking that road by himself. He had Dwayne, and maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild something from the wreckage of his past. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness, Blake said, looking down at his hands. About how hard it is to forgive myself, let alone anyone else. I'm not sure I'm there yet. I don't know if I'll ever be. Dwayne nodded thoughtfully. Forgiveness is a process, man. It's not something you do overnight. But it starts with giving yourself some grace. You can't move forward if you're still holding on to the past, blaming yourself for everything that went wrong. Blake let out a breath, the weight of Dwayne's words sinking in. Forgiveness, both for himself and for others, wasn't something he could rush. It would take time, just like everything else. But the first step had been made. I think I'm ready to start, Blake said, his voice firm but uncertain. I'm ready to face it. Dwayne smiled, his eyes gleaming with approval. Good. That's all you can do. Start. And the rest will follow. Blake sat back against the bench, staring out at the peaceful park before him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace inside himself. It wasn't all figured out yet, but he was taking the first step. And that was enough, for now. Later that day, Emily sent him another text, this time a simple, almost hesitant message. Thank you for listening today. I know we have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful. Blake stared at the message for a moment, then typed his reply. I am too. One step at a time. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, feeling, for the first time in years, like he was on the path to something better. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was no longer as daunting. He could finally breathe. Blake awoke the next morning with a sense of clarity that had been absent for so long. The conversation with Dwayne the day before had been eye-opening, but it was the message from Emily that lingered in his mind. One step at a time, those words echoed in his thoughts as he tried to navigate the emotional maze he had been caught in for years. The night before, Blake had stayed up late thinking about everything. He had thought about Emily, about their marriage, about the hurt they both carried. But he also thought about forgiveness. About how forgiveness wasn't something he had to give all at once. It could be given in pieces, a little at a time, and maybe that's what would allow him to finally heal. Blake's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up to see a text message from his sister, Rachel. Hey, Blake, I know things have been crazy lately, but I think we need to talk soon. I've been hearing things, and I want to make sure you're okay. Let me know when you're free. He read the message twice, the weight of her words sinking in. It had been a while since they had spoken seriously. Blake wasn't sure what Rachel meant by things, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't ready to face anyone else just yet. Not with everything still unsettled inside him. Still, he knew he'd have to respond. He typed a quick reply. Hey, Rachel. I'll call you later. Let's catch up soon. Blake set the phone down and stared out the window, unsure what to do next. There was something comforting about the quiet moments when he was alone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that more was coming. More challenges, more truths to face, and more people to confront. He couldn't keep hiding forever. By noon, Blake was pacing the small apartment he had been renting since the divorce. The walls felt closer today, and the sense of isolation was harder to ignore. He had done everything he could to keep his head above water, but each conversation, each step toward resolving the past, left him feeling more exposed. It was like peeling away layers of a wound he had tried so hard to ignore. He grabbed his jacket and left, deciding to take a walk to clear his head. The day was cold, but the air felt crisp and fresh, offering a brief respite from the emotional fog that had been clouding his mind. As he wandered through the streets, the city seemed quieter than usual, as if it, too, was giving him space to think. Blake's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another text from Emily. I know I said it before, but I just wanted to thank you again for what we talked about yesterday. I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking about us and the mistakes we both made. I don't expect things to change overnight, but I just want you to know that I'm here. Whenever you're ready to talk again. Her words weren't demanding, nor were they filled with any sense of urgency. It was just an honest, straightforward message. But Blake couldn't help but feel the weight of them. They felt like an olive branch, but he didn't know if he was ready to reach out and take it. His mind wandered back to the coffee shop, to their conversation. It had been raw and emotional, but still, there was so much left unsaid. There were things he needed to understand about himself, about why he had let their marriage deteriorate the way it had. And there were still things Emily had never truly explained. It was impossible to know if they could ever get back to a place of understanding, let alone rebuild anything. But Blake knew one thing: if they didn't continue the conversation, they'd never have a chance to heal. Blake's phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from Rachel. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Hey, Rachel, Blake said, his voice hoarse. Blake, Rachel replied, her tone filled with concern. I've been hearing things, and I want to make sure you're okay. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I don't care about the details, but I care about you. I just want to make sure you're not doing something rash. Blake's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios. Was she referring to his recent interactions with Emily? Or was she talking about his own mental health, his struggles with the weight of everything? He wasn't sure how to answer. Rachel, I'm dealing with a lot right now, Blake said, choosing his words carefully. I'm not sure what you've heard, but I'm fine. I've just been trying to figure some things out on my own. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Blake could feel Rachel's frustration, even through the silence. Blake, come on. You know I'm not going to let you go through this alone. I know you think you can handle it by yourself, but this isn't something you need to face alone. You have family. You have me. I'm not just here for the good times. I'm here for the hard times, too. Blake swallowed hard. It wasn't easy for him to admit it, but Rachel was right. He had always been the strong one, the one who handled things on his own, and he had distanced himself from everyone in the process. Maybe it was time to stop pushing people away. Maybe it was time to let them in. I know, Blake murmured. It's just. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to fix things. You don't have to fix everything at once, Rachel replied gently. You just have to take the first step. Whatever it is, I'm here. Blake took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle. Thanks, Rachel. I really appreciate it. There was a moment of silence before Rachel spoke again. Just don't shut me out, okay? And take care of yourself. We'll talk soon. Blake ended the call and sat down on a nearby bench, his thoughts swirling. Rachel's words had struck a chord. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. He needed to be honest with himself, with his family, and with Emily. The road ahead was long, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to walk it alone. Later that evening, Blake sat down to write a message to Emily. He had been thinking about their conversation, about the possibility of forgiveness, and about where he could go from here. It was time to take the next step, to open up even further. Hey Emily, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I know we still have a lot to talk about. I'm not ready to make any big promises, but I think I'm ready to take the next step. Let's meet again soon and talk more. One step at a time, right? He hit send, and for the first time in a long while, Blake felt a small spark of hope. The past was heavy, and the future was uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. The next morning, Blake received a reply from Emily. I'm glad to hear that. I've been thinking about the same thing. Whenever you're ready, I'm here. Blake smiled to himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had taken another step forward, and for the first time, Blake felt like he could breathe again. Blake wasn't used to feeling this open. The conversations with Emily and Rachel had felt like a step forward, but something was still missing. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt like there was a lingering weight he hadn't fully addressed. Maybe it was the guilt that still clung to him like a shadow, or maybe it was the fear that no matter how many steps he took forward, he'd always be running from something. That morning, as Blake prepared his coffee and sat down at the small kitchen table, he reflected on how his life had spiraled out of control. He had tried to focus on getting his work done, keeping things as normal as possible, but it always felt like there was something unresolved hanging over him. And no matter how much he wanted to move forward, it seemed like the past would never leave him behind. His phone buzzed again. Blake, it's Dwayne. I was thinking. I know we talked yesterday, but I want to check in. Do you have time later today to grab a coffee? I think we both could use a breather. Blake looked at the message for a moment. The invitation didn't surprise him, but it was the timing that felt strange. It seemed like everything was happening at once. He had barely processed his conversation with Rachel and was still unsure about his next steps with Emily. Yet, here was Dwayne, offering another lifeline, a chance to keep moving forward in a world that often felt like it was constantly spinning out of control. He typed a quick response. Yeah, I'm free this afternoon. Let's meet up. The coffee shop Dwayne had suggested was cozy, with the smell of fresh espresso filling the air. Blake arrived first and sat down at a table near the window, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The quiet hum of conversation around him was soothing, and he appreciated the calm. As much as he was grateful for the company of his friends and family, sometimes the noise of it all could be overwhelming. Dwayne arrived shortly after, looking as laid back as ever, dressed in a casual t-shirt and jeans. He gave Blake a wave as he approached the table, settling in with a coffee of his own. Thanks for meeting up, man, Dwayne said, leaning back in his chair. I know things have been a lot lately. Just wanted to check in and see how you're holding up. Blake sighed and took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. Honestly, I'm just trying to figure it out, you know. Everything's moving so fast. I think I'm still in shock a little bit. Dwayne nodded knowingly. I get it. Life throws curveballs at you, and sometimes it's hard to keep up. But it's all about how you deal with it. You can't just let it control you. Blake was silent for a moment, the weight of Dwayne's words sinking in. He had spent so much time letting his past dictate his actions that he had forgotten what it felt like to take control of his own life. For so long, he had allowed his mistakes to define him, thinking they were the only thing that mattered. But now, he was starting to see things differently. "I don't know what's worse," Blake said, breaking the silence. "The fact that I've messed things up, or the fact that I keep running from it. I don't even know how to make things right." Dwayne's gaze softened. "Making things right doesn't always look the way you expect it to. It's about making peace with where you are now and moving forward. You can't undo the past, but you can make choices that help you grow." Blake nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about Emily. And honestly, I don't know if I'm ready to fix everything. But I want to try. I think I have to." Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "You think you have to? You don't have to do anything, Blake. But if it's something you want, if it's something that can bring peace to you and her, then maybe it's worth the effort." Blake leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on the swirling steam coming from his coffee. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. He had to make a choice, even if it meant facing the unknown. "I'm tired of running, Dwayne," Blake said quietly. "I've been running from everything, my mistakes, the things I've done, the things I haven't done. But it's time to stop. I don't know if I'll get it right, but I'm ready to try." Dwayne smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "That's all anyone can do. Try. The rest will follow." Blake appreciated Dwayne's perspective, the calm way he spoke. He didn't pretend that everything was easy or that things could be fixed overnight, but he did offer a sense of hope. It was the same hope that Blake had been desperately trying to hold on to, even when it seemed like the darkness would never lift. As they continued to talk, Blake found himself opening up in a way he hadn't before. He talked about the pain of losing his marriage, the guilt he felt for not being the man Emily deserved, and the fear of repeating his mistakes. And through it all, Dwayne listened, offering insights and support without judgment. After a while, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. They talked about sports, work, and random life updates. For a moment, Blake felt like the weight had lifted, like he could breathe without the constant pressure. It was a small relief, but it was relief nonetheless. When they parted ways later that afternoon, Blake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't keep running. He had to face what was ahead, one step at a time. That evening, as Blake was getting ready for bed, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, recognizing Emily's name on the screen. "Blake, I know we said we'd take things slow, but I think we need to talk again soon. I want to hear more from you about how you're feeling. No pressure. Just, whenever you're ready." Blake's heart raced as he read the message. A part of him felt like he was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But another part of him was terrified. Was he ready for this? Was he ready to open up completely? With a deep breath, Blake typed his response. "I think I'm ready. Let's talk soon." He hit send and set the phone down, his mind swirling with possibilities. Blake knew he was facing the biggest challenge of his life, but he also knew that he couldn't face it alone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Blake felt a small flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road he was finally ready to walk. Blake woke up the next morning with a sense of anticipation. The message from Emily was still fresh in his mind, and the idea of speaking with her again filled him with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He hadn't expected things to move so quickly, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that avoiding the conversation wouldn't solve anything. He had to face it. He had to face her, and he had to face himself. He spent the morning pacing around his apartment, trying to steady his nerves. There was still so much uncertainty between them, so much unsaid, so much pain, but Blake knew that they could only move forward if they took that first step. And that step was coming soon. Emily had suggested they meet at the same coffee shop where they'd had their first serious conversation, and Blake was already on his way there. As he walked through the door of the cafe, he spotted Emily almost immediately. She was sitting at the same corner table, her eyes focused on her phone, but when she saw him, her face broke into a soft, tentative smile. Blake's heart skipped a beat. "Hey," he greeted her, his voice hoarse. He felt the weight of the situation in the air. This wasn't just a casual meeting, it was a chance to clear the air, to confront the past, and maybe even start over. "Hey," Emily replied, her voice just as quiet. "Thanks for meeting me. I know this isn't easy." Blake sat down across from her, his hands feeling clammy. "I don't think anything about this has been easy," he said softly. There was a moment of silence between them, neither of them quite sure where to begin. It wasn't like before, there was no avoiding the emotions in the room. They were both here because they had something they needed to say. They both had things to work through, and there was no escaping the truth any longer. "I've been thinking a lot," Emily began, breaking the silence. "About everything. About us. I don't know if we can ever fix what's broken, but I don't want to give up without trying." "Not completely." Blake's chest tightened. He had expected the conversation to be difficult, but hearing her words brought it all back, the guilt, the shame, the loss. It felt like a weight on his chest, but it also felt like a chance for healing. Maybe they could start to pick up the pieces. "I don't know what I'm doing, Emily," Blake confessed, his voice raw. "I've been so lost. I thought I had it all figured out, but I've been running from the truth for so long that I forgot what it felt like to just be real with myself." Emily's eyes softened, and she leaned forward. "I get that. I've been running from things too. I think we both had our reasons, but that doesn't make it okay. We both hurt each other." Blake nodded, his mind swirling with emotions. "I hurt you. I know that. I failed you, and I don't know if I can fix it. But I want to try. I want to be a better person, for both of us." Emily reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. "You don't have to fix everything all at once. And I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to try. I need to see that you're willing to face the mistakes, to face the things we've both been avoiding." Blake looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes almost making him break down. This wasn't about fixing the past, it was about taking the first step towards something new. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew that if they didn't try, they would be left with nothing. "I'm willing to try," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if it's enough, but I want to start over. I want to be honest with you. I want to be honest with myself." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "That's all I've ever wanted from you. Just honesty." There was a long pause as the weight of the conversation settled between them. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but they had taken the first step. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean, but it was real. "I don't know what comes next for us," Emily said, breaking the silence. "But I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to take it one step at a time." Blake smiled faintly, the first real smile he had given in what felt like ages. "One step at a time," he repeated, the phrase feeling like a promise. They sat together for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. Blake didn't feel the pressure to have all the answers, and neither did Emily. They were both just two people trying to find their way through the mess they had made of things. But in that moment, Blake realized that the mess didn't have to define them. It didn't have to control them. They had a chance to rebuild, to start again. As they parted ways later that afternoon, Blake felt a sense of relief. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been freeing. They had spoken openly, without the walls they had built around themselves for so long. And though the future was still uncertain, Blake knew that they had taken a significant step forward. As he walked back to his apartment, Blake's mind was buzzing with possibilities. He wasn't sure what would happen between him and Emily. There were still so many things to figure out, so many hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Blake felt hopeful. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he had the strength to face whatever came next. That evening, as Blake sat down at his kitchen table, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Rachel. "Hey, just wanted to check in. How's everything going? I'm here if you need to talk." Blake smiled softly. Rachel had always been there for him, and the fact that she was reaching out now meant more than he could express. He didn't have to go through this alone. "Thanks, Rachel. I think I'm finally starting to figure things out. We should talk soon." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift. He had made progress, and though the road ahead was still long, Blake knew that he wasn't walking it alone. The conversations with Emily, with Rachel, with Dwayne, they were all steps in the right direction. He didn't know exactly where they would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. As the evening sky darkened, Blake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The past didn't have to control him. He could still choose his future, one step at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Blake's heart-to-heart conversation with Emily passed in a blur. There was a part of him that wanted to believe everything would be magically fixed after that moment of honesty, but the truth was, healing was never going to be that simple. His mistakes were not going to be undone overnight, and neither was the trust that had been broken. But, as the days wore on, Blake realized that something had shifted. Maybe it was the honesty. Maybe it was the vulnerability. Either way, he felt something in himself begin to change. That afternoon, Blake took a walk through the park. It was a quiet, crisp February day, the sky a pale blue that promised warmth later in the season. The park was peaceful, with only a few scattered joggers and dog walkers dotting the path. Blake loved the simplicity of it. He could think clearly here. No noise. No distractions. As he walked, his mind naturally drifted back to Emily. What she'd said kept echoing in his head, "I just need you to try." That was it, wasn't it? He'd spent so long avoiding the hard conversations, hiding behind excuses, letting his guilt take control. Emily wasn't asking for him to be perfect. She wasn't even asking for him to have all the answers. She was just asking for an effort. A real, genuine effort to be present, to face the truth, to work through the mess together. Blake stopped at a bench by the edge of the park and sat down. He pulled out his phone, checking for any new messages, and then, as if on instinct, he opened the Notes app. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. He had done this before, written out his thoughts as a form of self-reflection, but something felt different today. Today, it felt like there was more clarity. "What do I want?" he typed. He stopped, staring at the words. What did he want? Not just in terms of his relationship with Emily, but in life. What was he really seeking? "I want peace. I want to be the person I know I can be. I want to face my mistakes, my fears, and the messes I've made. I want to grow, to be better for myself, and for the people who still care about me." He paused before continuing. That felt right. It was an honest answer. But then came the harder part. "I want to rebuild with Emily. I'm not sure how, but I want to try. I want to be real. I want to fix what I've broken, if it's possible. But I know it starts with me." Blake sat back against the bench, looking at the words he had just written. There it was, his commitment, not just to Emily, but to himself. The first step toward healing wasn't about fixing things with her right away. It was about fixing himself first. He couldn't be the man she needed until he was the man he needed to be. The question now was, how? How did he begin? One afternoon, as Blake was leaving work, he ran into Rachel. She was standing outside the coffee shop, holding a to-go cup, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Blake. I was just about to text you," she greeted with a bright smile. Blake grinned, glad to see her. "Hey, how's it going?" Rachel's smile softened, and she gestured for them to walk. "You know, same old, same old. But I wanted to check in. You've been pretty quiet lately, and I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "Really okay?" Blake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the last few weeks come crashing down on him. "I'm getting there," he said, glancing over at her. "It's been a lot. I had a big talk with Emily. The kind we should have had a long time ago. But I don't know if that fixes everything." Rachel nodded, her expression understanding. "It's a start, though. Right? And that's important. You're starting to take ownership of everything, not just for her, but for yourself. That's huge, Blake. Most people avoid it." Blake looked away for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to this level of openness, even with someone like Rachel, who had been a supportive friend for years. But in this moment, he needed the reassurance. "You know, I feel like I've been running from this for so long," he said, his voice low. "From the truth, from myself. I think I'm trying to figure out how to be better." Rachel stopped walking, her eyes locking with his. "Blake, I know you. I've seen you go through some hard stuff, but I've also seen you grow. You're not who you were a year ago, or even a few months ago. You're moving forward, even if it doesn't always feel like it." Her words settled over him like a gentle weight, and for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to believe them. Maybe he didn't have everything figured out. Maybe there was still a long road ahead, but he wasn't alone. He had people who cared. People who wanted to see him succeed, who wanted to see him find peace. "I don't know what's going to happen with Emily," Blake confessed. "But I'm doing the work. I think that's the only thing I can do right now." Rachel smiled, a soft, reassuring smile. "That's all anyone can do. You're doing the right thing, Blake." Later that evening, after the conversation with Rachel, Blake felt an unexpected sense of calm. There was a sense of clarity that had settled into him, a realization that he could begin to rebuild. He didn't have to have all the answers right away, but he could start somewhere. And that somewhere began with the work he needed to do within himself. It wasn't just about making things right with Emily. It wasn't just about getting his life back to some version of normal. It was about him finding peace with his own decisions and moving forward with the understanding that the past didn't define him, not completely, at least. He could change, he could grow, and he could be better. And maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild something beautiful along the way. With Emily. With the people who still believed in him. With himself. As Blake lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change, but it was a change nonetheless. He had taken the first step toward healing. Now, all that was left was to keep moving forward. One day at a time. The next morning, Blake woke up to an unusually quiet apartment. The sun was barely peeking through the curtains, casting soft, golden beams across the room. His head was pounding from the weight of the conversations he'd had over the past few days, but his heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. He had taken the first step. That was the most important part, right? But even as the light filtered through his window, there was a lingering feeling in the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. What if it wasn't enough? What if all this effort to change, to do the work, still wasn't enough to fix the past? Blake sat up in bed, rubbing his face with both hands. He could feel the pull of doubt, the whisper in the back of his mind that told him this wouldn't work. That Emily wouldn't be enough. That he wasn't enough. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking his spiraling thoughts. It was a text from Dwayne. "How's the soul searching going, man?" Blake chuckled softly, knowing Dwayne well enough to understand the underlying message. His friend wasn't just asking about his day, he was asking if Blake was truly doing the hard work of introspection. "It's going. Not easy, but I think I'm getting there." "What's up?" "Just checking in. I know this process is tough, but don't lose sight of what you're doing. You've been through worse. This is nothing you can't handle." Blake smiled at the encouragement, but there was a sense of frustration there too. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Dwayne's words, it was just that the doubt wasn't something his friend could simply talk away. The doubt felt real. It felt like a part of him. He couldn't just push it aside. Before he could respond, another message popped up. This time, it was from Emily. "Hey, are you free this weekend? I was thinking we could talk again. I know things are still up in the air, but I want to try and work through this with you, if you're ready." Blake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to reach out so soon, especially after their last conversation. There was still so much uncertainty between them, but her words were a lifeline. They were a sign that she was willing to meet him halfway. The question was he ready? He thought about it for a moment, tapping his fingers on the phone screen. They hadn't promised anything last time. There had been no guarantees. But Emily's willingness to try, to open herself up to him again, was something he couldn't ignore. "I'm ready. Let's figure this out together. When and where?" He hit send before his mind could talk him out of it. As the day went on, Blake tried to focus on the tasks at hand. He had meetings at work, errands to run, and a few other responsibilities to take care of, but in the back of his mind, all he could think about was the upcoming weekend. The thought of meeting with Emily again, after everything that had happened, made him both nervous and hopeful. Could they really work through everything? Could they rebuild what they had? But it wasn't just about Emily. It was about him too. The more Blake thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't keep questioning himself, second-guessing every decision. If he truly wanted to make things work, he had to trust that he was doing the right thing. He had to trust that the work he was putting in was enough. Later that night, as Blake sat down to dinner, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Rachel. "You good? I know you've been deep in thought lately, but don't forget to take care of yourself. You deserve peace too." Blake smiled at the simple message. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of all the confusion and self-doubt, he wasn't alone. Rachel was right. He had to take care of himself if he wanted to heal. He stared down at his plate, pushing the food around absent-mindedly. The truth was, Blake wasn't sure if he was ready to face Emily. But maybe that's why he had to. If he wanted to grow, he had to keep moving forward, even when it felt uncertain. Even when the doubts crept in. That night, as Blake lay in bed, the noise of the world fading around him, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was the hardest part, the waiting, the wondering, the constant tug of fear and hope pulling him in different directions. But he knew something now that he hadn't known before, he couldn't let his doubts control him. He had to believe in the possibility of something better, something real. And tomorrow, he would take another step forward. Saturday arrived faster than Blake expected, and he felt the weight of anticipation hanging in the air like an electric charge. The night before, he had barely been able to sleep, tossing and turning with thoughts of what the conversation with Emily might hold. There was a part of him that still wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew that he had to face whatever came. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but it also pushed him forward. He took a deep breath as he stepped out of his apartment that morning, feeling the cool winter air against his skin. It was a beautiful day, but his mind was elsewhere, on Emily. The coffee shop she had suggested for their meeting was a cozy, quiet place near the waterfront. Blake had been there a few times before, and while it wasn't his favorite, it felt fitting for what was about to unfold. This wasn't just a casual coffee run, it was an attempt at understanding, at rebuilding. The clock on his phone showed that it was almost time. He checked himself in the reflection of a nearby window, his shirt was freshly pressed, and he had made sure to look presentable, even though he knew Emily wasn't expecting perfection. This was about more than appearances. It was about showing up, about being there with his whole self. As he walked into the coffee shop, the warmth hit him immediately, the smell of espresso filling the air. It was busy, but not too crowded, and there, sitting by the window, was Emily. She looked the same as she had the last time they'd seen each other, no sign of the exhaustion that Blake felt inside himself. She looked calm, collected, as if she had a sense of peace that Blake was still struggling to find. When she saw him, her face softened, a small, almost hesitant smile curling on her lips. It was enough to make Blake's heart skip. He returned the smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was still so much left unsaid, so much left to figure out. But in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope. Blake took a seat across from her, and they both fell into a quiet moment, just staring at each other for a beat. There was a weight in the air that neither of them could avoid. They had both been here before, sitting across from one another in moments of silence, but this time felt different. There was a vulnerability in the room, a sense that they were both treading carefully on fragile ground. Emily was the first to speak. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I know things are complicated. And I know we've been through a lot, but I wanted to at least try. I don't want to give up, Blake." Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't want to give up either," he admitted, his voice low. "But I don't know how to fix everything. I've made so many mistakes. I've hurt you, and I don't even know where to start." Emily nodded, her eyes flickering with emotion. "I know. But I'm not asking you to fix everything in one conversation. I just want to know that we're both willing to try. I'm willing to try. But it's going to take time, and we both have to be patient with each other." Blake sat back, taking in her words. He could feel the sincerity behind them, and for the first time in a while, he wasn't consumed by his own self-doubt. The fear that had clouded his mind for weeks started to lift. Maybe he wasn't ready for everything, but he was ready for this moment. He was ready to hear her, to listen, and to be there, fully present. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm here. And I'm willing to do the work. I've been running from myself for too long, and I can't keep doing that. Not if I want to be a better person, for you and for me." Emily looked at him, her expression softening. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Blake. I don't even expect you to be perfect. But I need to see that you're trying. That's all I can ask for." Blake nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was being seen for who he truly was, mistakes and all. Emily wasn't asking for a perfect version of him, she was asking for authenticity, for effort, for honesty. "I can do that," Blake said, his voice steadier now. "I can try. I'm ready to face whatever comes, even if it's hard." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words lingering in the air. Blake realized that this wasn't just about their relationship, it was about something deeper. It was about both of them finding their own way forward, individually and together. Emily broke the silence, her eyes meeting his. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice tentative. Blake thought about it for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm willing to find out. I'm willing to take the next step, however long it takes." A soft smile appeared on Emily's face, one that reached her eyes this time. "That's all I need to hear." As the conversation continued, Blake felt a shift inside him. The tension that had been so present between them was beginning to dissolve, replaced by the cautious but hopeful sense of possibility. This wasn't a perfect solution, and it wasn't an easy fix, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you need, a start. When they finally stood to leave, Blake felt lighter. The path ahead was uncertain, and the road to healing was going to be long, but he wasn't alone. Emily was there, and they were both willing to try. They were both ready to face whatever came next, together. As they said their goodbyes, Blake couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a real one, a moment of connection, of vulnerability, and of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like he could breathe. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Blake's mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of Emily and their conversation. The words they shared lingered in his thoughts long after the coffee shop had emptied, long after they had parted ways. In a strange way, their conversation had opened a door, one that he hadn't realized was closed until now. But even with the tentative hope that had taken root in his chest, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still holding him back. The past. It loomed over him like a dark cloud, a reminder of the mistakes he had made and the hurt he had caused. Blake had taken the first steps toward healing, toward being honest with himself and Emily, but he knew there was a long road ahead. The shadow of the past couldn't just be wished away. He had to face it head-on, no matter how painful it might be. He hadn't spoken to his family in months, and the strain between him and his parents weighed heavily on his heart. His mother had always been the voice of reason, the one who offered unconditional support, but even her patience had its limits. His father, on the other hand, had always been distant, more of a presence in his life than an active participant. It had always been easier to avoid their expectations than to confront the unresolved issues that had built up over the years. Blake hadn't been ready to face them. Not yet. But now, with Emily's willingness to try again, Blake realized that avoiding the past was no longer an option. If he wanted to truly move forward, he had to confront the ghosts that had been haunting him for years. That evening, as Blake sat in his living room, staring at the phone in his hand, he made the decision. He would reach out to his parents. It wasn't going to be easy, and he had no idea how they would respond, but it was time. Time to face the people who had shaped him into who he was today, both the good and the bad. His fingers hovered over the screen as he debated what to say. He hadn't called them in months. The words felt foreign, awkward, and yet, they had to be said. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I know it's been a while since we've talked, and I've been avoiding things. But I want to make things right. I miss you both, and I think it's time to have an honest conversation." Blake stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. His heart raced as he put the phone down, unsure of what would happen next. He had no control over how they would respond, but he knew that this was a necessary step in the process of healing. He couldn't move forward without addressing the unresolved tension between them. As he waited for a response, Blake felt a strange sense of vulnerability. It was one thing to face his own mistakes, it was another to face the people who had shaped him, who had expectations of him. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could start to rebuild the bridge that had been burned. Hours passed, and there was no reply. Blake tried not to let the silence get to him, but a part of him couldn't help but wonder if they had seen the message and decided to ignore it. He had been absent for so long, was it too late for them to care? Just as he was about to give up and go to bed, his phone buzzed. It was a response from his mother. "Blake, it's been a long time. We've missed you. I'm glad you're reaching out. Your dad and I would love to talk. Let's set something up soon. Love, Mom." Relief washed over him like a wave, but it was mixed with anxiety. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. He had no idea what kind of conversation awaited him, but at least he had taken the first step. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of healing old wounds. That night, Blake couldn't sleep. His thoughts raced as he replayed the conversation with Emily in his mind, then shifted to the message from his mom. It was a small thing, a simple acknowledgement, but it meant the world to him. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. The next day, Blake spent hours reflecting on everything that had happened. The painful moments from his past still weighed heavily on him, but there was a new sense of determination inside him. He wasn't going to let the past dictate his future anymore. He couldn't. He had too much to work for now. Too much to lose. He thought about his relationship with Emily, about how much progress they had made in just one conversation. There was so much to figure out, so much uncertainty, but Blake felt something stirring inside him. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was the realization that the work he was doing on himself, the work he had yet to do, was going to be worth it. He had already started the process of healing with Emily, now it was time to heal the other parts of his life. The truth was, Blake was scared. Scared of what he might find when he confronted the past, scared of how his parents might react, scared of losing Emily, scared of being too much, too little, too broken. But he knew this was the only way to truly move forward. He had to face the fear, face the pain, and trust that in the end, it would be worth it. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the moment settle around him. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The following week was a blur for Blake. Between work, the lingering tension with his family, and his growing connection with Emily, he had little time to think clearly. The weight of his past, both the familial issues and the internal struggles he'd kept hidden for so long, pressed on him like a storm cloud threatening to break. Every step forward seemed to bring him closer to a breakthrough, yet every moment of peace felt fragile, like it could all come crashing down at any moment. Blake had been working on repairing his relationship with his parents, slowly but surely. His mother had responded positively to his text, and they had agreed to meet up for dinner later in the week. He still wasn't sure what he would say or how it would go, but he knew he needed this. He needed to confront his past head-on, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. It wasn't lost on Blake that his relationship with Emily was also moving forward, albeit in smaller, more subtle steps. Their second meeting had been less intense, but it was filled with real conversations. They talked about the things that had hurt them, the misunderstandings, and the pain they had caused each other. It was a raw exchange, but it also allowed them to see each other for who they were now, not just for who they had been in the past. Despite the progress, Blake couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was still carrying something with him, something he hadn't yet fully acknowledged. As much as he wanted to move forward with Emily, there was a shadow that hung between them, a barrier that neither of them seemed ready to address. That barrier was the truth. The truth about what had really happened between them all those months ago. Blake hadn't told Emily everything. Not yet. He hadn't shared the full extent of why he had left so suddenly. The reasons behind his actions were tied to a deep-rooted fear, one that he hadn't been able to admit to anyone, not even to himself. Blake had left because he didn't believe he was worthy of love, not from her, not from anyone. He had convinced himself that he was too broken to be loved, too damaged to be accepted for who he truly was. He had let his own insecurities and fears dictate the course of his life, and it had cost him everything he held dear. Emily deserved to know the truth. She deserved to understand the depth of his fear, the dark place he had been in when he walked away. He couldn't keep hiding it from her. That night, after another long day of work and self-reflection, Blake sat down with a notebook in front of him. He had written down his thoughts many times before, trying to sort through his emotions, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was writing for someone else. For Emily. His pen moved slowly across the paper as he carefully constructed the letter. Every word felt like it was a weight being lifted from his chest, but each sentence also carried the fear of rejection. Would she understand? Would she see past his flaws, his weaknesses? Would she still want to try, even after knowing the truth? Dear Emily. I've been thinking about you a lot. About us. And there's something I need to tell you. Something that's been eating away at me for a long time. I can't keep it from you anymore. He paused, his hand trembling slightly. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this vulnerable with anyone. But Emily deserved the whole truth, not just the parts he was willing to show. When I left, when I walked away from you, I didn't do it because I didn't love you. I did it because I didn't love myself. I was so afraid that I wasn't good enough for you. I was terrified that, if you really got to know me, if you saw the real me, you would leave, just like everyone else. I was running from myself, from the fear that I was too broken to be loved. And I thought leaving you would protect you from that. From me. Blake stopped again, taking a deep breath. He could feel his chest tightening, but he knew he had to keep going. He couldn't stop now. I've spent so much time trying to fix things on my own, but the truth is, I can't do this alone. I don't know if I'm ready for everything, but I know that I want to try. I want to be a better person, for myself and for you. I need you to know that I'm not perfect. But I am trying, every day, to be better. He wrote until the words seemed to flow without hesitation, until everything he had kept buried came spilling out onto the paper. By the time he finished, he felt drained but also lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. I don't expect you to have all the answers either, Emily. I just need you to know that I'm here, and I want to be honest with you. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the chance to try again. If you're willing to give me that chance, I promise I'll do my best to be the person you deserve. Love, Blake. Blake folded the letter, took a deep breath, and glanced at the clock. It was late, but he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let the fear hold him back any longer. Without another thought, he sent the letter to Emily. As soon as he hit send, Blake felt a rush of emotions. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was also a sense of relief. It wasn't a guarantee that Emily would respond in the way he hoped. He couldn't control her feelings, and he knew that. But what mattered was that he had finally been honest. He had faced the fear, and in doing so, he had taken control of his own story. The next few days passed slowly. Blake went through his daily routine, but his mind was always on the letter. Had Emily read it yet? Was she processing it? What would she think of him now? On the third day after sending the letter, Blake received a message. It was from Emily. Blake, I don't know what to say yet, but I'm glad you shared this with me. I need some time to think about everything, but I want you to know that I hear you. And I appreciate your honesty. Blake stared at the message for a moment, his heart heavy with both relief and uncertainty. This was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, Blake felt a sense of peace. Whatever the future held, he knew that he had faced the truth, and that, in itself, was a victory. The days that followed felt like an endless stretch of time. Blake's life had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. He had laid bare his most painful truths to Emily, and now, with nothing left to do but wait, he found himself caught in the uncomfortable limbo of uncertainty. Every notification from his phone felt like a potential breakthrough, but the longer the silence stretched, the more Blake questioned himself. Did he say too much? Was Emily really processing everything he had shared, or had it scared her off? He tried to convince himself that her response was a good sign, that she hadn't shut him out completely, but doubt gnawed at him. He spent hours distracted at work, trying to keep his mind occupied. Each time he walked into his office, he found himself glancing at his phone, checking for any new messages from Emily. But each time, he was met with nothing. The silence was deafening. His thoughts drifted back to his family. He had told himself he would reach out to his father soon, but each time he sat down to make that call, his nerves got the best of him. Blake didn't know how to fix the years of silence and disappointment between them. His father was a man of few words, and they had always struggled to connect. But now, more than ever, Blake realized that if he wanted to move forward, he had to break that cycle. The unresolved tension with his father was just as much a part of his past as the failed relationships and the mistakes he had made. That evening, as Blake sat in his small apartment, the weight of it all seemed to press down on him. His apartment, though comfortable, felt too quiet, too empty. The familiar feeling of loneliness crept back in, and he was reminded of the isolation he had felt in the years before meeting Emily. She had changed things, brought a light into his life that he hadn't even known he was missing. But now, as he waited for her response, he realized just how fragile that connection was. The phone buzzed, and Blake's heart skipped a beat. He quickly picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a message from Emily. "Blake, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I want you to know that I don't take your honesty lightly. But there are some things I need to work through before I can fully process everything. Can we talk soon? I don't want to rush this, but I think I need some space to figure things out." Blake stared at the message, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Emily wasn't shutting him out, but she wasn't ready to dive into everything just yet. He understood, but the wait felt agonizing. What did space mean? How long would she need? Would she come back to him after she had processed it all, or was this the beginning of a slow fade? His fingers hovered over the screen as he drafted a response, but the words felt inadequate. He didn't want to pressure her, but he didn't want to let this fragile connection slip away either. "I understand, Emily. I'm here when you're ready, and I respect your need for space. Just know that I'm thinking of you, and I'm grateful for the chance to work through this." He hit send, then leaned back against the couch, staring at the screen in his hand. The message had been simple, but the uncertainty behind it felt heavy. How long would it take her to figure things out? And what would happen if she decided she couldn't move past his past? The following days brought little progress. Blake kept busy with work, though his mind was rarely focused. He would check his phone every so often, his heart sinking when he didn't see a new message. But then, a week later, something unexpected happened. It was late in the evening when Blake received a call from his mother. The last time they had spoken, he had shared his intention to reach out to his father, and she had been encouraging. Now, her voice on the other end of the line was steady but concerned. "Blake, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think it's time for you to have that conversation with your dad," she said gently. "He may not always show it, but he's been waiting for you to come around. This isn't just about the past, it's about moving forward." Blake exhaled slowly, the familiar tension tightening in his chest. "I know, Mom. I want to. I just don't know where to begin. We've never had the easiest relationship, and every time I try, it feels like I'm just not getting through to him." "You don't have to have all the answers," she replied. "Just start with the truth. Start with what you've learned. He may surprise you, Blake." Blake wasn't sure whether his mother's optimism was misplaced or if it was exactly what he needed to hear. Either way, he knew it was time. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about repairing the relationships he had let slip through his fingers. The past couldn't stay buried forever. "I'll do it, Mom," Blake said softly. "I'll call him tomorrow." The next day, Blake found himself sitting in his car, parked outside his father's house. He had been here countless times before, but this felt different. His heart raced as he clutched the phone in his hand, wondering what words he would use to break the silence that had hung between them for so long. When the call finally went through, it was his father's familiar voice on the other end. There was a brief, awkward pause, before Blake spoke. "Hey, Dad. It's Blake. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I think it's time we talked." There was a long silence before his father responded. "What do you want to talk about?" Blake hesitated for a moment, then decided to speak from his heart. "I think we need to talk about where things went wrong. I've been avoiding this for a long time, but it's time to face it." His father's voice softened. "I'm listening." And just like that, they were finally talking. It wasn't perfect, and the conversation was difficult, but it was a start. Blake couldn't predict what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally taking control of his own narrative. And then, just as he was wrapping up the call with his father, a new message came through on his phone. It was from Emily. "Blake, I've been thinking, and I think it's time we talk. Can we meet tomorrow?" Blake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Everything was happening at once. The past and present were colliding in ways he never expected. And though he didn't have all the answers yet, one thing was clear: he was ready to face whatever came next. Blake stared at the message from Emily, his heart pounding in his chest. The uncertainty that had gripped him for so long seemed to dissolve in that single moment. Emily wanted to talk. After a week of silence, it was as if a door was finally opening, and Blake couldn't help but feel a rush of anticipation mixed with nervousness. What would they talk about? Would they be able to move past their shared history, or would the weight of the past be too much to overcome? He quickly typed a response, trying to keep his words simple but sincere. "Of course. I'll be there. Just let me know the time and place." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The next day, Blake spent the morning trying to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the meeting with Emily. What did it mean that she was finally ready to talk? He hadn't expected things to move so quickly, but the truth was, he was relieved. The waiting, the constant wondering, it had been unbearable. Now, finally, they had a chance to sit down and address everything. When the afternoon rolled around, Blake found himself standing in front of a quiet cafe in the city, his hands slightly clammy. He had arrived early, as he always did when he was anxious, and now he was left alone with his thoughts. He hadn't even considered what he would say when they sat down. Everything that had been building up in him, his fears, his hopes, his regrets, was coming to the surface, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it all. As he waited, Blake's phone buzzed. Emily's name appeared on the screen. "I'm here. I'm sitting inside." He took a deep breath, smoothing out the front of his shirt. Then, without another thought, he pushed open the door to the cafe and stepped inside. Emily was sitting at a small table near the back, her face slightly turned toward the window as if she were gathering her thoughts. When she saw him, her face softened into a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Blake's stomach flutter with nervous energy. "Hey," Blake said, his voice slightly hushed as he approached the table. "Hey," Emily replied, her voice steady but warm. She gestured for him to sit. "Thanks for meeting me." Blake nodded, taking a seat across from her. There was a moment of silence before either of them spoke again, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Emily looked down at her hands, fiddling with the edge of her coffee cup. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in that letter. It wasn't easy to read, Blake. I'm not going to lie. But I'm glad you were honest." Blake's heart sank for a moment. "I know it wasn't easy, and I didn't expect it to be. But I needed you to understand why I did what I did. I've carried that guilt for a long time, and I didn't want to hide it from you anymore." Emily met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something, an answer, perhaps, or a reason to believe that he had truly changed. "I didn't know you were going through all of that, Blake. I had no idea. It makes sense now why you left, but it doesn't make it hurt any less." "I know," Blake whispered, feeling the sting of her words. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just so lost. I didn't know how to be the person you needed me to be." There was a pause as Emily processed his words. Her eyes softened, and Blake could see the struggle in her expression, her heart torn between the pain of the past and the hope for something more. "I don't know what to do with all of this, Blake," Emily said quietly. "I want to believe you. I really do. But I also don't want to keep getting hurt. I've been hurt enough." Blake swallowed, his own emotions threatening to choke him. "I understand. I don't expect you to just forgive me right away. I know that it's going to take time. But I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was when I left. I'm working on myself. And I'll keep working on myself, for as long as it takes." Emily looked down at her coffee again, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. The silence stretched between them, thick with uncertainty. Blake could see that Emily was still processing everything. He couldn't force her to forgive him. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done. But he could be patient. He could give her the time and space she needed to come to her own conclusions. Finally, Emily looked back up at him, her expression softening. "I think I need some more time, Blake. To really figure out what I want. But I appreciate that you're trying. I do. And that means something to me." Blake nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a step forward. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He didn't know where that path would lead, but at least they were walking it together, even if they were walking at different paces. "I'll give you as much time as you need," Blake said softly. "And whatever happens, I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes flickered with something, maybe hope, maybe hesitation, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the table, her fingers lightly brushing against his. The gesture wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a sign that they weren't as far apart as they had been before. For a moment, they simply sat there, both trying to navigate the space between them, both unsure of what the future held. But for the first time in months, Blake felt like they were moving forward, slowly, yes, but steadily. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still so many things unsaid, so many emotions still raw. But it was enough. For now. "I'll see you soon, okay?" Emily said softly, her hand lingering on his for a moment longer before she pulled away. "Okay," Blake replied, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Take care of yourself, Emily." As Blake stood to leave, the weight on his chest seemed a little lighter. The future was still uncertain, and there were many things left to work through. But one thing was clear, Emily hadn't given up on him. And for that, Blake was willing to keep trying. He stepped out of the cafe and into the evening air, feeling the cool breeze against his face. The road ahead might be long and uncertain, but Blake had learned something important that day: sometimes, the hardest thing to do is face the truth. But when you do, when you finally open up to the people you care about, it can change everything. The days following Blake's meeting with Emily were filled with a delicate mix of optimism and doubt. The lingering tension between them hadn't disappeared, but there was a spark of something deeper, an unspoken understanding that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge until now. Blake found himself constantly replaying their conversation, picking through the words they had exchanged, looking for clues as to where they stood. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the right path. But while Emily's words had been a sign of progress, Blake couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. Every time he reached for his phone, he wondered whether his next message would be met with the same silence that had plagued him before. Was Emily truly ready to move forward, or had she only given him a temporary hope to cling to? Blake couldn't afford to let his emotions take control, especially now that he was standing at a crossroads in more ways than one. That weekend, Blake decided to take a break from his usual routine and escape the noise of the city. He had always found solace in nature, and after everything that had transpired, he needed space to think. A short hike through the woods was the perfect opportunity to clear his mind. As he laced up his boots and grabbed his gear, Blake felt a sense of anticipation that mirrored his earlier feelings of nervousness. The hike might give him the clarity he was desperately searching for, both about Emily and about his relationship with his father. The trail was quiet, with only the sound of his footsteps on the dirt path and the rustling of leaves in the trees. Blake breathed deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. The city felt like a distant memory now, the stress and noise replaced by the soothing hum of nature. As he walked, his mind wandered back to the conversation with his father earlier in the week. For the first time in years, they had spoken honestly, and while Blake knew it wouldn't fix everything, it had felt like a real breakthrough. He had learned things about his father, things he didn't fully understand yet, that would require time to process. But it was a start. And that's all Blake could ask for at this point. Blake paused for a moment, leaning against a tree and taking in the beauty of the forest around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, unsure of what to expect. It was a message from his father. "Blake, I've been thinking about what we talked about. I know it's been a long time, but I want to make things right. I'm not good at expressing myself, but I'm here if you need me. Maybe we can try again, together." Blake's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was progress. His father was reaching out in a way he never had before. Blake felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, but also a deep sense of uncertainty. What did this really mean for their relationship? Was this the moment they both started to heal, or was it just a temporary gesture? Blake typed a response quickly, his fingers moving with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. "I'd like that, Dad. Let's figure this out, together. I'll call you soon." He hit send, then let out a slow breath. It wasn't the perfect answer, but it was a step forward, and that's all he could ask for. As Blake continued his hike, the weight of his thoughts seemed to lighten. The simple act of reaching out, of starting to rebuild the relationships that mattered most, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like he was on the path to something better. When he finally reached the summit, Blake took a moment to absorb the view before him. The sprawling landscape stretched out below, the rolling hills and endless trees a reminder of how vast the world was. It was easy to feel insignificant in a place like this, but as Blake stood there, he felt the weight of his decisions begin to shift. He was part of something bigger than himself, part of a greater story that was still unfolding. There were still so many things he didn't understand, but he was no longer afraid to face them. As he made his way back down the trail, Blake's phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from Emily. "Blake, I've been thinking a lot. I don't know if I'm ready to have all the answers yet, but I think we should try again. If you're willing to wait for me, I'm willing to try. We'll take it slow, but I think we can make it work." Blake's heart soared as he read the words. It wasn't a promise of instant clarity or perfection, but it was a start. She was willing to try. And for now, that was enough. As Blake typed his response, he realized something important. He had finally reached a place where he was ready to face the unknown. No matter what happened with Emily, no matter what happened with his father, he was no longer defined by the mistakes of his past. He was ready to rebuild, to move forward, and to give himself the space to grow. "I'm willing to wait, Emily. I'm ready to take it slow. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together." He hit send, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. There were no guarantees in life, no guarantees that things would work out the way he hoped. But at least now, he was on the road to something better. And that was all that mattered. As Blake made his way back to the city, the weight of the past no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a lesson, a reminder of how far he had come. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Blake felt hopeful. Blake's phone buzzed on the counter, the notification illuminating the dim light of his apartment. His heart fluttered with anticipation before a sense of dread crept in. It was a message from Emily, and though he told himself to remain calm, the knot in his stomach tightened with every passing second. He had been waiting for her response, but as days stretched into weeks without clear resolution, the uncertainty had begun to eat away at him. They'd talked. They'd both expressed their desire to move forward. But something was still holding them back, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the past weighing heavily on them. There was more, something unspoken between them. Blake hesitated for a moment before he unlocked the screen. "Blake, we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow at the same cafe?" Her message felt like a small spark to a growing fire, and his mind raced with questions. What was she going to say? Was this it? Was she finally ready to end things? Or was she about to reveal something he wasn't prepared for? There were only a few minutes left before he had to leave for work, so Blake quickly typed out a reply. Of course. I'll see you tomorrow. He locked the phone and went about his morning routine, but the thought of their meeting tomorrow loomed over him, casting a shadow over everything. Blake tried to focus on his work that day, but his mind constantly drifted back to Emily. He hadn't realized how deeply his heart had invested in the possibility of them working things out until now. It was as though he had built this fragile hope, and he didn't know if it would survive the weight of the reality they had to face. When the day finally ended, Blake rushed home, still unsure of what to expect. He spent the evening pacing, unable to sit still. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that had him restless, it was the raw vulnerability he felt every time he thought about their future. Emily had always been someone he could rely on, someone he had shared everything with. But now, after all that had transpired, he was no longer sure of where they stood. They had shared so much, yet, there was still so much left unsaid. The next morning, Blake woke up early, his mind already spinning. He dressed quickly, not even bothering to eat breakfast, and headed straight to the cafe. Every step he took felt like it was leading him closer to something he wasn't sure he could handle. When he arrived, Emily was already sitting at the same table they'd met at before. Her back was to the window, but there was a sadness in her posture that Blake couldn't ignore. She looked up as he approached, her eyes dark with something Blake couldn't quite place. The warmth that had been present in their last meeting was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Hey, Blake said softly, taking his seat across from her. How are you? Emily didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as though trying to read him. I'm okay, she said after a beat. But I need to be honest with you, Blake. Blake's heart skipped a beat. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he didn't expect it to feel so final. The words had barely left her mouth when a wave of apprehension washed over him. I've been thinking a lot, about everything. And I realized something, Emily continued, her voice soft but firm. I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I can keep waiting for us to fix things. There are parts of me that want to, but there's this part that's just, exhausted. I can't keep putting myself through this. I can't keep hoping for something that may never happen. Blake felt the air leave his lungs, as if everything had suddenly gone silent. He wanted to speak, to convince her that they could make it work, that he could be the man she needed him to be. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, a sharp pain twisted in his chest. I'm sorry, Blake, Emily said quietly, her eyes glistening with the hint of tears. But I think it's time for us to go our separate ways. Blake opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. He could barely comprehend what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended. They had made progress. He had worked so hard, so damn hard, to try and rebuild their relationship, to prove that he was worthy of her love again. And now, just when he thought they were starting to heal, Emily was telling him that it was over. He couldn't find his voice, couldn't even speak through the suffocating weight of disappointment that pressed down on him. His chest tightened with a sense of failure, like everything he had done, everything he had hoped for, was slipping through his fingers. I know you want more time, and I've thought about that. But I've realized that I'm holding on to something that isn't there anymore. Maybe I was hoping things would magically change, but they haven't. And I don't know if they will. Blake stared at her, feeling the sharp sting of rejection. But behind that, there was something else. Something deeper that Blake had never fully understood. He had always thought that love, at its core, was supposed to be enough. But now, staring at Emily, he realized it wasn't enough to just want to make it work. They both had to be willing to fight for it, together. And somewhere, deep down, Blake knew that Emily wasn't ready to do that. "I'm not angry," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want us to end things on bad terms. I just think we've come to a point where we need to let go. It's not about you, Blake. It's about me. And what I need to be happy." Blake took a deep breath, trying to hold himself together. He had wanted this meeting to be the beginning of something new, but instead, it felt like the end of something important. His heart ached as he realized the truth: they were no longer the same people who had fallen in love so long ago. But even through the pain, Blake couldn't help but admire Emily's courage. She was choosing herself. And, as much as it hurt, he understood that. I understand," Blake said, his voice hoarse. "I'll always care about you, Emily. I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed." For a moment, Emily didn't say anything. She simply reached out and squeezed his hand, her touch soft and warm. "I know you tried, Blake," she said quietly. "I really do." The silence between them deepened, and as Blake sat there, he realized that some things simply couldn't be fixed. And while it was heartbreaking, there was a certain peace that came with that acceptance. They had loved each other, but sometimes love wasn't enough to save a relationship. As they parted ways, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment that would define everything that came after. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready to let go. The days after his meeting with Emily were like a blur for Blake. Everything felt muted, like he was walking through life in a fog, trying to find his footing again after everything had shifted. He kept telling himself that he would eventually be okay, that time would heal the wounds. But no amount of time seemed to be enough. He spent most of his days at work, pushing himself to stay busy, but the constant ache in his chest remained. Every time he thought of Emily, he felt the sharp sting of loss. Blake had always been someone who believed in the idea of love as a fix-all solution. He had believed that if he worked hard enough, if he was just patient enough, everything would fall into place. But Emily's departure had shattered that belief, and now, he found himself questioning everything. If love wasn't enough to make things work, then what was? One evening, after yet another long day at the office, Blake decided to go for a walk. He needed to clear his mind. As he walked down the familiar streets, the city felt more foreign to him than it ever had before. The world kept moving, people walked past him, lost in their own lives, while Blake was stuck in this void, struggling to come to terms with his reality. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his father. "Blake, I know things have been tough. I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, but I want you to know that I'm here. Let's try to talk more, okay?" Blake stared at the message for a long time, the words sinking in slowly. After everything that had happened between them, his father was reaching out. For a moment, Blake felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of the connection they had once shared. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Blake, something was better than nothing. He typed a quick response. "Thanks, Dad. I'd like that. Let's talk soon." As he put his phone back in his pocket, Blake thought about the path he had been walking with his father. It had always been rocky, filled with miscommunication and unspoken expectations. But maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to rebuild something that had been lost. He wasn't sure how it would work or where it would lead, but the fact that his father was reaching out meant that there was hope for a future that didn't revolve around disappointment. But that was the thing about hope, it was fragile. Blake had already experienced the sting of it slipping through his fingers when it came to Emily, and the thought of putting his heart out there again made him anxious. Could he trust his father, or would the cycle of disappointment repeat itself? Blake's mind was swirling with questions when he arrived at his apartment. He let himself in, and the emptiness of the place seemed to settle over him. He hadn't been here in weeks, avoiding the quiet that echoed through the halls. He was tempted to pick up his phone and send another message to Emily, something, anything, to fill the silence. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. She had made her decision. He had to respect that. The days turned into weeks, and Blake found himself adjusting to this new reality. He kept up his usual routine, buried himself in work, and tried to keep his emotions in check. But there were moments when the weight of everything would hit him, the empty space in his apartment, the ache in his heart, and the overwhelming sense of loss. He missed Emily more than he cared to admit, but he knew deep down that it was over. No matter how many times he replayed their good moments, the truth remained, they couldn't go back. One night, after a particularly draining day, Blake found himself at the bar. He hadn't been out in weeks, but something about the loneliness of his apartment was getting to him. He needed to be around people, even if he didn't know how to truly connect with them. He took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, trying to push his thoughts of Emily and everything else out of his mind. But it was hard to escape the thoughts that had been circling in his head for so long. The bartender, a woman with bright red hair and a warm smile, noticed Blake's somber expression and struck up a conversation. Her name was Sarah, and Blake found himself talking to her more than he had talked to anyone in a long time. They talked about everything, work, life, and the occasional random topic that made Blake laugh. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't that Sarah had any answers, or that she could fill the void that Emily had left, but there was something about the conversation that made Blake realize he wasn't as alone as he had thought. It was the small connections, the little moments of human interaction, that reminded him that life continued, even after heartbreak. As the evening wore on, Blake found himself getting lost in the flow of conversation. It was a welcome distraction, something he desperately needed. But as the night came to an end and he left the bar, the loneliness crept back in, pulling at him like a heavy weight. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, answers, closure, or simply a sense of peace. But for now, he had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The next day, as he sat at his desk at work, Blake's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and saw that it was a message from Emily. His heart skipped a beat, but he reminded himself to take a deep breath before opening it. Blake, I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I don't want us to be strangers. I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to know that I'm always here if you need me. You've always been someone I cared about, and that's not going to change. Blake stared at the message, the words settling into his chest like a bittersweet weight. Emily was reaching out, but it wasn't the same as before. She wasn't asking for him to come back, wasn't offering a solution. It was just a reminder that the past still lingered between them, like a ghost that wouldn't let go. He typed a response, his fingers moving slowly. I care about you too, Emily. And I'm grateful for everything we shared. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll always remember the good times. Blake hit send, then stared at the screen for a moment longer before putting the phone down. He didn't know what the future held. Maybe things with Emily would stay in the past, and maybe he'd never have the answers he was looking for. But he had to believe that, in time, he would find his way. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for now, he was willing to keep moving forward. Blake woke up early the next morning, feeling an odd sense of quiet within himself. The lingering ache from his breakup with Emily had started to fade, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in months. The numbness, the feeling that had haunted him for weeks, was dissipating, slowly giving way to something different, a sense of possibility. His phone buzzed again. Blake didn't need to check it to know it was another message from Emily. He hadn't responded to her last one yet, choosing instead to reflect on it quietly. As he reached for the phone, the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. He had spent so much time replaying their relationship in his head, agonizing over what went wrong, wondering if there was something he could have done differently. But the truth was, some things simply weren't meant to be. Blake opened the message. I've been thinking a lot about the things we talked about. And I just wanted to say that I hope you find peace, Blake. I hope you find what you're looking for. You deserve it. He let out a breath, feeling a knot loosen in his chest. It wasn't a message that promised reconciliation, but it was a message of closure, something Blake had been craving for so long. She wasn't asking for anything from him. She wasn't clinging to the past. Emily was moving on, just as he needed to. The truth was, they both needed to heal. And as painful as it was, their separation was the only way for that healing to begin. Blake had learned that lesson the hard way. He set the phone down and stood up from his bed, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, illuminating the apartment in a way that felt oddly hopeful. He walked to the kitchen, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the counter. There was something in the air that morning, a shift, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Blake had always believed in the idea that life had a way of leading you exactly where you needed to be, even if you couldn't always see the path clearly. And as he sat there, drinking his coffee, he realized that he was ready to take that next step forward. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew it was time to stop looking back and start looking ahead. Later that afternoon, Blake decided to take a walk to the park. It had become a small ritual of his, getting out of his apartment, clearing his head, and simply being in the moment. Today, he needed it more than ever. As he walked through the park, he reflected on how much he had changed in the last few months. It felt as though everything was different, his perspective on life, on love, and on himself. He was no longer defined by his past with Emily. He was no longer the person who was waiting for something that would never come. Blake smiled as he passed a group of children playing on the swings. Their carefree laughter filled the air, a reminder that life continued, no matter how heavy it sometimes felt. The world was still full of joy, of moments that were waiting to be discovered. He reached a quiet bench by the lake, sat down, and closed his eyes for a moment. The soft breeze blew through the trees, rustling the leaves, and Blake felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was as though the universe had given him a moment of respite, a breath before he moved forward into whatever was next. He pulled his phone from his pocket, thinking about his next step. The message from his father still lingered in his mind. Maybe it was time to truly reconnect with his family. Maybe it was time to let go of the resentment, the hurt, and try to rebuild what had been broken. Blake opened his contacts and sent a message to his father. "Hey, Dad. I've been thinking a lot about our relationship. Let's set up a time to talk. I'm ready if you are." He hit send, his heart racing slightly as he awaited a response. It had been so long since they had shared anything meaningful. Blake wasn't sure what the conversation would be like, but he knew it was time to take the first step. The minutes passed slowly as he sat there, reflecting on the journey he had been on, the pain, the growth, the moments of doubt, and the moments of clarity. Every single experience had led him here, to this moment, where he was beginning to understand that healing wasn't something that could be forced. It wasn't something that could be rushed. It took time, patience, and the willingness to let go. Just as he was about to put his phone back in his pocket, it buzzed. His father's reply came through. "I'm glad to hear that, Blake. Let's talk soon. I'm here when you're ready." Blake couldn't help but smile as he read the message. It wasn't the grand reconciliation he had once imagined, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you needed, just a start. He leaned back against the bench, looking up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. In that moment, he knew that his journey wasn't over. There was still so much ahead of him, so much to learn, and so much to experience. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. Blake stood up, taking one last look at the park before walking back toward his apartment. There were still challenges to face, but he knew he could handle them. The weight of the past was no longer holding him back. It was time for a new beginning. He was ready to embrace it. Blake woke up the next morning feeling a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the type of anxious anticipation he was used to, the kind that came with uncertainty and dread, but something different. There was a lightness to his steps as he got out of bed, the kind of lightness that signaled a shift in his mindset. His phone buzzed again, another message from his father. Blake had thought about their last conversation all evening, and now, his father was reaching out again. He felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this process of rebuilding relationships. "Blake, I know we haven't had a lot of heart-to-hearts lately, but I'm looking forward to talking with you. Whenever you're ready, I'm here." Blake took a deep breath as he read the message. There was sincerity in his father's words, something he had been waiting for all these years. He could feel the walls he had built between them beginning to crumble, piece by piece. But now, more than ever, he realized that reconciliation couldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and patience from both sides. And he was willing to give it that chance. He replied, "I'm ready, Dad. Let's talk. I'll call you this afternoon." He felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he sent the message. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. A step toward healing, toward understanding, and ultimately, toward finding peace. The day passed by in a blur of activity, but Blake found his thoughts continually drifting back to the conversation he would soon have with his father. He had no idea what to expect, but he was ready to face it, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. The hardest part had always been opening up, letting others in, but he was beginning to realize that the only way forward was through honesty and vulnerability. When the afternoon came, Blake took a deep breath and dialed his father's number. It rang a few times before his father picked up. "Blake," his father's voice sounded warm, yet there was an underlying nervousness, something Blake hadn't heard in years. "How are you?" Blake paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I'm good. I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us. And I think it's time we talk, really talk." His father's voice softened. "I agree. I've been doing a lot of thinking too. And I know I haven't always been the father you needed. I'm sorry for that." Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to his father's words. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a start. "I'm sorry too, Dad," Blake said, his voice shaky. "I've held on to a lot of anger for a long time. But I think I'm ready to move forward, if you are." They spent the next hour talking, about the past, the mistakes, the things they had both held onto for too long. There were moments of silence, but they weren't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like a breath between sentences, a space for understanding. Blake realized that while he could never undo the past, he could choose to let it go. He could choose to heal. As the conversation drew to a close, his father said, "I'm proud of you, Blake. And I'm here for you. Always." Blake felt a tear slip down his cheek. It was a moment of release, a moment he didn't know he had been waiting for. "Thank you, Dad. I'm proud of you too." After hanging up, Blake sat in his chair for a few moments, letting the words sink in. He wasn't sure what the future held for him and his father, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about their relationship. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be immediate, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's all you need, just a beginning. As Blake stood up, he walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. It was the kind of sunset that reminded him that there was always something beautiful on the other side of darkness. He had learned so much over the past few months. He had learned that life wasn't always predictable, and that sometimes, the answers weren't clear. But he had also learned that healing was a journey, and that it was okay to not have everything figured out. Sometimes, you just needed to take that first step, even when the path seemed uncertain. Blake's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Blake, I've been thinking about you. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're finding peace." He stared at the words for a moment, his chest tightening. It wasn't the message he had been hoping for, but it was enough. She was still thinking of him, still caring from afar. And maybe that was all they needed. They didn't need to have all the answers or all the closure. They simply needed to accept that things had changed, and that was okay. Blake typed back a simple response. I'm doing well, Emily. Thank you for reaching out. I wish you nothing but happiness. He hit send and sat back, feeling a sense of release. Emily was moving on, just as he was. Their paths had diverged, but that didn't mean they couldn't still care for each other from a distance. It didn't mean the love they had shared was any less real. It simply meant that it was time to let go. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Blake wasn't afraid. He was ready to embrace whatever came next, to continue growing, and to find peace within himself. It was a new beginning. And Blake was finally ready to live it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?